Hi guys, welcome to Santino's World. As always, I am Santino DeFranco. It would probably be weird if I was anybody else. And today I've got Josh Rosenblatt on with me, and he is the author of a book, which let me grab this for you guys, and it is titled Why We Fight. And that is probably in reverse for you because my camera is in selfie mode. But Josh was a normal human, not a fighter, had a life as a writer and as an editor. He was a former editor of Vice's Fightland. And then Josh decided to go become a cage fighter and go fight in a cage. And in his book, he documents it. So hi, Josh. Welcome. Good to have you. So talking about the book, we'll get into I did the 30-second, this is what the book is about. You were a writer, you were a normal human, you decided that you were going to fight, and then you document it in the book. Give me a rundown just of like what went through your head. Why did you decide, first of all, actually even before we get into why you decided to fight, give me your life up until you decided that you were actually going to fight. You went to school, you were an editor, you were a writer, and then, kind of pull us up to speed in a quick version of just a normal human's life.
Yeah, I suppose the main thing is that I was sort of the exact opposite of, I guess, a fighter, in that I had never fought. I went through my entire life, my entire childhood, my entire adolescence without ever being in a fight. I was very much, growing up and into my adulthood, I was very much a cerebral guy. I was very much into writing, into reading, and I didn't do sports really. I just didn't care about that stuff very much, and I didn't really treat my body very well. I was a smoker and a heavy drinker, and the whole thing. It's real decadent. I think I sort of admired the sort of decadent poets and that sort of thing.
You want to be like Ernest Hemingway. You're drinking and smoking and writing.
I was the opposite. I did it was that I got to Hemingway eventually. I was more in sort of the I guess the sort of the John Keats, the sort of like the real decadent poet, just doing I wanted to do opium and stuff. I never did opium, but in my imagination I wanted to do opium. But yeah, I was for years I was a writer in Austin, and I was a journalist in Austin, and I was writing about movies, and I was writing about politics, and I was writing about all these things. And just by a fluke, I read a story in ESPN about MMA, and this was 10 years ago and it was a story about Kimbo Slice. And okay. I read the story about him, and it was this profile, and it was right at the peak of his sort of notoriety, when those YouTube videos had really sort of started making some noise. And I'm reading the story, and they're talking about him, and they're talking about all the people that he's beaten up and the whole thing. And I'm completely repulsed. I think it's disgusting. I think it's awful. I can't believe human beings are fighting in backyards and videotaping it. Morally, I'm just so terrified by the whole thing. And it probably would have ended there, except halfway through the article, the writer starts interviewing professional mixed martial artists, and I don't remember who they were at the time, but they were guys that I now would recognize their names, guys in the UFC. And to a man, they all said, yeah, Kimbo would get killed in a cage. And every one of them, confidently. And these guys I'd never heard of before. And I'm sitting there, I'm hearing these stories about Kimbo Slice, and I'm looking at this giant muscular man who just looks like pure terror. And I'm like, what in the world? How is it possible that this guy who's just creaming people in backyards would be terrible in MMA? So my curiosity got the better of my morality, and I started watching some videos, and it was like a light went off. I don't know why it was the case, because again, I'd sort of avoided watching fights all those years, and I didn't like early UFC when it was really a circus, just
before the rules,
before the rules, and guys' teeth are flying out and the whole thing, and a sumo wrestler versus a tiny boxer. It didn't do anything for me. But I started watching some fights, and I just became fascinated immediately. It really was like a light bulb turning on, and it was within a matter of weeks that I was watching.
Were you watching fights online, or were you?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, just went on YouTube, and I think I did a little research because I wanted to see who the good ones were. I wanted to see, okay, I'm gonna if people can beat up Kimbo Slice, I want to know who the best one was. And to be totally honest with you, I think what really secured my interest and my love for MMA was the fact that the first guy that I really watched was Fedor. And the fact that Fedor didn't look at all like what I thought fighters were supposed to look like, and what turned me off about fighters so much, that he didn't get in your face. He wasn't covered in tattoos. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like that guy in a movie who's the bully who treats the kid, the intellect. He didn't look like a bat. He was calm and he was placid and he seemed very sweet, and he had that bowler's belly. I mean, he just looked like a guy. And
He looked like a guy who's going to cook you a meal in his restaurant, not fight you.
exactly. And then he would generally get beaten up for the first half of the fight, and then somehow manage to beat everyone. And I think that he really allowed someone like me to get into fighting, because if it had been what I thought it was,
Tattoos and bald heads and like.
I saw a video recently that I had never seen before, and it was when at sort of the peak of Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, and they had like walkout videos with the tap out guys with the masks, and they were playing nu metal.
Oh, it was horrible.
If that's what I had seen first, I would not be sitting here with you.
We were just talking about that intro recently with, Tito's with the flames coming up. But the worst was Chuck Liddell's, where it was like that, is it getting cold in here?
Oh, the Iceman.
Oh, the Iceman. That was the worst one. Because it was like WWE intros, but like the worst bad WWE intro and like the worst market you've ever seen. They were bad. That would turn anybody off.
Terrible production values, and unlike WWE, they were actually harming each other. So I was like, if it had been that, I would have gotten nowhere near it. But the fact that it was, I mean, that was the thing I fell in love with first about MMA. It was two things. Was one, you don't have to look like how I thought you were supposed to look, and two, every fight I saw, they would hug each other afterwards, and that just, it just piqued my curiosity. I was like, what's going on? Something's going on here that I don't understand. If these guys are hugging after a fight, because every instinct I had said that fights end they're always governed by malice, and they end in malice, and everything about it I hated, but they were hugging each other, and I was so curious.
And so you started watching fights, and then in your book you say that you went to a fight. How did that happen? How did you end up at the fight? Was it something that you were commissioned to do for work, as a journalist, or was that something that you just wanted to like go watch?
You know what? There were sort of two revelation moments, especially in terms of this book, but in terms of my life in the last 10 years, there was the revelation of falling in love with the sport. And then it was the realization that, because again, I was writing about movies and I was writing about politics and all this stuff. And especially nowadays in the age of the internet, you sort of if you write a movie review, 10,000 other people write a review of that movie that week. And you sort of plop it on the internet and it goes into a giant hole, and most likely no one's going to hear about your review, and no one's going to read your story unless, it's controversial or it's whatever. It's very difficult to, I don't know. I got to a point where I didn't like the fact that I felt like I was writing about what everyone else was writing about. And at the same time I was starting to watch these fights, I started to read the great boxing writers and realized how many great writers, period, had spent time writing about boxing. And I sort of came to the realization, I was like, this is a wide open field. Like, not many people are writing about MMA in an interesting literary kind of a way.
It's funny that you say that, because you're writing now for, we'll get into, some of the stuff in your book. You're writing for the Daily Dot. And what I've noticed is your write-ups for those are very literary, and they're very visceral. They bring you into the moment, into not just wins and losses and how people fight, but you really do a good job of merging the literary world, which, like you said, which is funny that you say that you would see in these old boxing write-ups that you don't see in MMA anymore, but you used to see in the boxing. And you even see it a little bit. Kevin Iole does it a little bit. Kevin Iole, I think, is one of the true journalists in our sport. He writes for Yahoo, but he was writing for boxing for the last 30 years, and you really see him put a lot of really good journalistic, your journalism traits into an article, but then he brings in some good storytelling as well. And you do that, which is one of the reasons why I really enjoy your columns on the fights as they're coming up, because I think people have lost that. They're trying to sensationalize everything, or just, honestly, MMA journalism is bad. It's always the same questions. What did you do leading up to the fight? What is your training camp? How is your weight? And just boring. It's really boring. So I appreciate that. I appreciate that type of writing. And as a writer myself, I appreciate good writing going into the sport.
Well, I appreciate that. And there is something about, I don't know what it is, but there's something about writing about fighting that just, I don't know. It's a bit of a muse for me. I mean, it has inspired me to be a much, much better writer, and I don't know why. But I will say this, that I think that fighting, for whatever reason, provides me a great angle to write about other things. Like, I don't think I could write about race or gender or social issue. I don't think I could write about that stuff directly head on. But all of that stuff is addressed in the fighting.
In the book.
And and you could sort of use, I find that it's easy to sort of use fighting as a way to talk about the things that, the other things that I feel like need to be discussed. But as a consequence, what that meant was that I was sort of in this situation where I was falling in love with fighting, and I was like, you know what? I think I want to write about MMA, because at the very least, whether it succeeds or it fails, at the very least, I'll be one of the only ones doing it, as opposed to how many people are writing a review of the newest Matrix movie. And
the thing with MMA is people could be writing about MMA all over the world at any given time, but they're not all writing about the same fight. If you're at a local fight in Austin, you're there, you're writing about a specific fight there, where somebody else is writing about a different fight somewhere else. And so you get a little bit of individuality, a little bit of, this is personal to you, and nobody else is writing about that fight right now.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, some of my favorite. I think the first thing I wrote about was a very small event in Austin, and there was no reason why that event would have been on the radar of anyone else who wasn't in Austin at that time and just happened to be at that fight. But yeah, I mean, that's how it happened. I mean, I think I said to my editor, who was generally pretty decent about letting me write about various things, I said, I want to go to this fight. I want to see what it's like to write about MMA. And I guess I had built up enough goodwill writing movie reviews that he let me go.
Were you writing for a paper in Austin at the time, or who were you writing for at that point?
I had like 3 publications that I wrote for in Austin.
Okay.
Yeah.
How old were you at the time? So this is about 10 years ago.
I was when I started getting into, I think I was 33.
Okay, so 33, you go to your first fight. Never even seen fight, which is funny, and this is one of the reasons why I really enjoy having you on talking about this book, is because you have a perspective, and you bring this into the book. Most MMA books you read are fighters, somebody involved in MMA, and then they write about MMA. And so you get the perspective of somebody who's been involved in MMA their entire lives, whereas you have not been involved in MMA your entire life, and you bring the perspective of an outsider, of somebody who has nothing to do with the sport coming in and getting involved in the sport. And that's what I think is interesting about this, is you bring the different point of view. Most other books bring the point of view of the fighter. You bring the point of view of somebody who's not a fighter, your whole life. And that's why I find this really interesting. And as I was reading the book, I grew up, fighting my whole life. I had my first fight when I was 18. I watched every UFC fight live, and except for the first one. The very first UFC fight, 93, I watched actually right before the pay-per-view for the UFC 2 came out live. And so this is all I'd ever known. So hearing your take on a lot of these things was much different than my take on a lot of these things. And that's what I think people should really enjoy, is the outside. Like, this is not, like, to me, MMA is just normal. This is just what I've always known. But to you, the weight cut, what people are doing, beating each other's faces, like not understanding if this is something that should be done or not, and grappling with it and finding your way in, that is the everyday person's take on fighting, which I find interesting. I appreciate the difference in point of view.
Well, I appreciate that. When I first was thinking about writing the book and when I was first pitching the book, it was really important I didn't want it to be just a memoir. Like I knew there had to be my personal experience had to be in there. But what fascinated me and the reason why there's so much science in the book and so much psychology in the book and so much history in the book is that I wanted to view myself as a case study. I sort of worked on the assumption that anyone going through the process of training for a fight and getting ready for a fight would go through exactly what I went through. And I really wanted to understand what happens to a human being in those sorts of heightened circumstances. And though it had to be about me for the sake of the storyline, that was less interesting to me than how when I was experiencing an adrenaline rush, I wanted to know what an adrenaline rush was, or when you're going through a weight cut, I wanted to know the fascination with fighting. I wanted to know why, so many other writers before me, from Norman Mailer all the way back to Lord Byron, all the way back to Homer, really, why there's that connection between writers and fighters. You, me, like there's this sort of small select group of people, and when I find them, I grab onto them so tight. Yeah. People who love writing and fighting in equal measure. I'm like, okay, you're my tribe, and you're going to stick with me whether you like it or not.
Because it's a little tribe. There's not a lot of
really a little tribe, but when you find one, then you could talk. Because I mean, we want to talk about fighting anyway all the time, but it's great to talk about fighting with someone who wants to talk about it in a slightly different way. It's like if I can combine those two things, I'm a pig in shit. So, yeah. So that was the main thing for me. It wasn't about making it. This is the story of Josh Rosenblatt doing this thing. It was really the story of I'm going to go out there and do this thing because I want to know why human beings do this thing.
Because you didn't just tell your story, you told everyone else the story. Like, this is what you would go through. This isn't just what I went through, but you did bring a lot of the history and a lot of the science into it. And so you actually educated people like, look, I'm going through this right now, but this is because X, Y, Z. This is what happens to your body. This is what, your body needs this nutrient. This is how you recover. This is what your brain goes through in these things. And I actually learned a lot as well doing it, which I appreciated.
Well, I'm curious, actually, that you mentioned that you saw the earliest UFC events and you've been fighting since you're 18. I'd be curious if you feel this the way I feel this, is there's definitely a pull I have to normalize the sport, to humanize the sport for people who think that it's inhumane and gross and it's something that only other people do. Like the fact that I went through this transition where I thought it was ridiculous and fell in love with it, I feel like this impulse to humanize it for people. And the best way I've found to humanize it for people is to say, oh, here's why people bleed the way they do. Here's why the injuries happen the way they do. Here's why their bodies do this, generalizing it and humanizing it means it makes it less sort of nebulous terror out.
Well, you're explaining it, and when you explain things, people are always uncomfortable with things they don't understand and things that they're not familiar with. And if you familiarize them, you explain to them in terms that they can understand, things that they're familiar with, physiology, psychology. If you start to break those things down, now you take away the scariness of it, and those walls are removed and people actually understand it. And then when they understand things, they're not afraid of them. And I thought you did a good job of that. And especially with me, like I said, as being a lifelong fighter, this is all I've ever known. And I was the person that you would expect to be in the sport, early in the sport. I was in a lot of street fights. I was unruly growing up. I was, I don't look at now. Now I'm a writer and I'm, wearing collared shirts and I'm, chatting with you on a podcast. But,
there you go.
When I was young, I was a real asshole. And so I don't get it. So hearing somebody else's point of view, initially I'd be like, no, that's just like some of the stuff you tend to romanticize fighting a little bit and you philosophize it a little bit, which I appreciate. Whereas with me, I'm like, no, this is just competition. This is waking up and, a lot of people romanticize labor work, building stuff with their hands and doing a craft and being a carpenter and actually building something. And usually the people that do that are white collar people who don't do that for a living. Whereas the people that do that for a living, they're like, this is just putting brick over brick because I have to build a house because I'm getting my $15 an hour. And that's how I look at fighting, is just give me my $15 an hour. A punch is a punch. You win this is just what it is. And I guess maybe as a fighter, I'm a little disenchanted, and it was nice to kind of bring a little bit more of that emotion back into it for me as a fighter, going, oh yeah, I could see. I don't like. I personally don't think I share anything with anyone that I've ever fought. Like, whereas you do, you have a kinship with your opponent, for your fight, and you're gonna remember that guy the rest of your life.
Oh yeah.
You're never going to forget that and this is weird because you're going to have some weird memories about that guy, the way that he felt, the way that he smelled, the way that his skin rough, was he shaved? Like, those are very intimate moments with another man, that you're never going to forget for the rest of your life. The way that his, the punch hit when it hit his skin, what he was doing to you, where, like, fighters, a lot of us that have done this forever, I couldn't even tell you everyone I fought. People would be like, oh, you fought so-and-so. And I'm like, huh? Who? When? Like, I don't even know.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yes. And so you're bringing, I really like the spin on that. Now, moving a little bit, did you decide to take a fight so you could write a book because you thought that would be something interesting to do? Or did you decide, I want to fight, okay, maybe I should write a book about it? Like, how did you merge the fighting and the book?
Well, I like, as you said, I had been the editor-in-chief of Fightland. It had been about 14 months. We had launched 14 months prior, and then they fired me because there was creative differences with my publisher.
Okay, wait. So we got to stop there for a second. Yeah. Because we got to go on that. Was working for Vice, because everybody actually Vice is in a lot of shit now, but for a while, Vice was the cool kid in town. Like, everybody wanted to work for Vice. Everyone wanted Vice everything. Vice was cool. Yeah. Was it awesome working there, or was it shit?
It was great to do Fightland. When I was writing, the opportunity to create Fightland was fantastic.
And how did that come about?
To work with you guys was just a fluke. Again, when I started writing, when I said to myself, I want to write about MMA, again, it was such like an open world. I had an old friend who just by chance used to work for, I'm going to forget it was the promotion that went down the night that Kimbo Slice lost. When Kimbo Slice lost his first,
was it Affliction or Elite XC?
I don't know which one it was, but it was one of those ones where it was like they were hinging everything on Kimbo, and he lost, and then like the next day, and then the next day the promotion shut down, and she worked for them. And again, I was to make fun of her because she worked for an MMA organization because I didn't know anything about it yet, but she knew a bunch of people, and she put me in touch with photographer whose name Esther Lynn, the great MMA photographer over MMA fighting. And we just chatted, and I said, hey, if you just happen to know of anyone who needs a writer, if I would love to I hadn't written anything about fighting yet, but I was like, if you know of anything. And she happened to know someone at Vice and they said they needed some MMA coverage. So I started writing for them. And I started hearing rumblings about this thing, Fightland. I would just hear the word every once in a while. And I asked my editor, what's going on with that? And he said, yeah, we're starting an all MMA website in a couple of months. And I wrote him and I said, look, I want you to know I will move. I was like, I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. So I will happily move. I will go anywhere you need me to go, but I want to be considered for this job. And I think I was just the one guy around. I was the guy who's writing about MMA for.
You're by default.
It was a pure default, yeah. And I took it, and I moved to New York from Texas, and so I wrote for them for about a year and a half or so, but there were some good parts about working for Vice. There were some lousy parts about working for Vice. I mean, there were elements that are sort of very Vicey, the things that sort of make Vice that I just never connected with. I mean, I never wanted to be scandalous, and
there's a lot of bros.
It's a very bro-y environment in a lot of ways. I didn't understand going there. This was 2012 when I went there, when I moved to New York. I had been writing for alt weekly newspapers in Austin. Like it's a very sort of 1960s model. I didn't know about branded content, and I didn't know that publications in particular Vice, which was sort of trendsetter in this regard,
Yeah.
that publications were now joining up with corporations and having, sort of blurring the line between advertising and editorial. I had never heard the word advertorial before. So to suddenly be in a situation where it was expected that I would, we never wrote any advertorial, but like that there are certain comments you had to take into consideration, whether we were working with certain products and certain corporations before you made fun of them or before you criticized them. It was messy from the beginning.
Well, I remember when I was writing, for you, and if people that don't know, I was writing for, contract work for Fightland for Vice, and you were my editor there. But there was a couple of times where I'd have, and not like I was making fun of the UFC badly, but I like to joke. I like to poke fun at people and prod. Just, it's my nature. And you'd be like, hey, why don't we just reword this a little bit? Let's take out this sentence about the UFC here or there. Nothing crazy. But it just shows that the UFC was given money and Vice was like, hey man, we're not pissing these guys off.
Yeah, it was, there were, I mean, it hurts me. It pains me to even hear you say that. And I know it's true. It's unfortunately the way it was. And I think about it now and it's like I knew from the very beginning, like I knew that the UFC was involved and there were sacrifices that had to be made. And it was a compromise. Part of me will always feel like the experience was hampered by and blackened by the fact that was the case. And I remember when Deadspin found out, and Deadspin contacted us, and they rightfully wrote a story essentially saying that Fightland was a shill for the UFC.
Yeah.
We never wrote stories. I wouldn't allow us to write stories that were just promotional pieces for the UFC. And there were actually very, very few circumstances where I had to or my publisher demanded that we change something or cut back on something, but it was always compromised in that way. And it was just it was the way it was, and that's what working for Vice is. And I think as a consequence, and for that reason, for several other reasons, I think I was probably doomed there. I mean, like when I think about when I got fired, I was extremely angry at the time. At the same time, when I got a little perspective, I was like, I was never going to be the guy who turned it into a Vice website. I was never going to be a guy who monetized it properly. I didn't know how to make money. I really liked well-written stories about fighting. And I liked stories that were well-written, that were not the kind of stories that were being published by all the other publications. Yeah. We didn't do stories that were like, Johnson promises knockout in next fight, or he's never felt, such and such fighter has never felt better going into, like, those stories were never going to be.
But those are done by everyone else, and you want a little bit of content. And again, you wanted something a little bit more literary. You wanted something that people gave a shit about, that wasn't just the news ticker just going and going. You wanted to actually get into some stuff and not sell your soul.
Yeah, and and unfortunately, this being the 2000s and media being the way it is, in order to get myself into a situation where sort of creatively I felt like I was doing something good for my soul, like it was selling my soul from the very beginning. I mean, it was what it was. And I remember when Deadspin contacted me and I was like, I have nothing to say because they were right. I mean, how was I going to defend it? We were in bed with the company.
You just agree with it and go on.
Yeah, I just said I have no comment, and thankfully they dumped the story on a Friday, and it's not like MMA fans give a crap where they're It's like if the story is good, we're going to read the story, but I guess the sort of the end analysis when I realized was that I was never going to be able to do for them what they needed me to do to make it successful by their standards. I thought it was extremely successful by my standards and by our standards, but I was never going to be the guy that took it to that place where it was making lots of money. So they were right to fire me, as angry as I was about it.
But you got something on your resume.
I haven't talked about that. I'm feeling very heated. I haven't talked about Vice in a long time.
It was one of those things I was so curious because I enjoyed working with you, and that actually when the editor after you came in, we did not get along at all. And I honestly, I think he was a a prick, just a bit of a douchebag. And he was what they wanted in you. He was, I could see the difference between him and you. You guys were night and day. And we did not get along well. And then I think I wrote a couple more articles and then I was kind of done. I was just like, I didn't want to do what he wanted, which is what you didn't want to do. You wanted to write and have good writing and good stories, which is what I enjoyed. And I think I started writing for you guys when I was in my MFA program as well. I think I was in grad school at the time. And that's what I enjoyed, is writing literary work and stuff with content, whether it's going to make you laugh or feel emotion or something. But I didn't just want to do like fluffy garbage. And that's what they wanted, was just kind of either just something to get clicks, a headline, or something sensational, again, to get clicks, clickbaity stuff that really wasn't content to get viewers, but they didn't want anything that was actually long form, that was actually interesting to me. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and working with you and a couple of other people that, I was the pleasure to work with some fighters who were writers as well, or behind the scenes people, was that that literary approach where it was like, we're going to give you a glimpse into this world that you don't get to see otherwise. I remember the stories that you wrote were like, great stories about like, flying to weird fights in weird places, fighting for weird promotions. And it's like, you're not going to get that unless you talk to the people who did it. Because that stuff was those aren't news stories, that's not what people, that's not the big promotion this week is putting on this particular show. But yeah, I mean, that was always going to be the thing. I mean, like, I was a writer first and an editor second, and whatever the other thing was that they needed me to be, I was way down the line and not even really that at all. So my whole thing was, I just wanted my writers, like all I wanted was to be tight with my writers. And like, I was like, these are my people. And that's a terrible way to run a business.
Yeah.
It's a terrible business.
Now, did you start training while you were in Brooklyn? Did you start boxing, training MMA while you were at Vice, or was that afterwards?
No, it's way before that. I started training. So before I moved to New York, I was living in Austin, Texas for many years. And I started training not long after I started just watching MMA.
Okay. Where did you start training first?
I started in Krav Maga. And that was purely circumstantial because I was watching MMA, but I was at a party and I met a guy who was a Krav Maga instructor. So he just said, "Why don't you come down and take a class?" So like that was purely circumstantial because I fell in love with the classes. I didn't start doing MMA training because the problem with Krav Maga, it's a great thing about Krav Maga is that it's pure self-defense, but you don't really
bite your nose, pull your hair, gouge your eyes.
It's hard to spar, right? It's hard to spar when you're allowed to knee a guy in the balls or bite his face.
Yeah.
So it was when I started realizing that I went through this period that I think probably a lot of people go through who are like me, who are not born and bred fighters or trained fighters who get into it a little later. You go through the first period where you fall in love with punching things. And then everyone has that moment where you sort of say to yourself, wait a second, I think I might want to get punched. And when that clicked for me, and I was like, it's not enough for me to punch bags. I want something that was going to punch back. That's when I moved over to Muay Thai and MMA because I needed to be in sparring situations.
And how long did you train? So you were training, how long was that before you moved to Brooklyn?
4 years, maybe 3 or 4 years.
Okay. So quite a while. So you'd been training, good amount. How much did you train? Was it like a 1 day a week thing, or did you go because what happens, people usually what we see in the gym is somebody comes in, somebody that's done it for, who hasn't done it, people fall in love and they go every day, all day, every second of their life is consumed now with this stuff until they fizzle out. Usually you don't see moderation.
Yeah. I went a lot. Yeah. I was that guy. I was never like a 2 times a day guy, but I was most days of the week for a long, long time. Really, to be honest with you, I'm 4 days a week now. I mean, I was sparring this morning, so it's not going anywhere for whatever reason.
Now, at the time, were you married at the time?
No, I got married. I got married 2 months before my fight.
Okay. Did you have a girlfriend at the time?
When I started fighting?
When you first started training?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay, because that's a thing where when you're not spending that much time, what people don't realize when you start training, like I said, you fall in love, and if you have a girlfriend, you and your girlfriend do normal stuff, you go to work, you come home, you see each other, and then all of a sudden you end up with another girlfriend in MMA, and you're there every day, all day, and that causes a lot of issues in relationships. So I was just curious to see if what your girlfriend thought at the time. Now, what about so when you met your now wife? What did she? So you had already been training at the time. What did she think of you training as much as you did? Did she think it was weird?
No, not at all. She liked that. And when I met her, I was in the process of I'd already had the idea for the book, and I had was looking for an agent, or maybe I'd gotten the agent right around the same time. So she knew my plans. She knew I
Okay.
was going to be fighting a fight. Like so she that was understood when we met. Like that at some point down the line, if everything goes well, provided someone pays for me to write a book, I will be fighting a cage fight. So that was always in the back of her mind. She was always aware of it. And yeah, she thought it was cool. She grew up watching boxing and stuff, so she was into it. She
Okay.
was not into me. She was not into it when she watched me fight.
Okay.
That was a terrible experience for her.
Yeah.
But everything else about it she liked.
So you'd been training. You left Vice, or Vice left you, and did you just decide like this is I'm going to write a book about doing a cage fight, or so say you didn't get a book deal, would you have done the cage fight anyway?
I don't know. I all I know is that I got fired, and then I had that sort of several months of just despair and depression, and
And whiskey. So it wasn't all bad because you had whiskey with you.
I still the whiskey has never let me down.
Okay, good. Yes. Rarely does he.
Yeah, he's always there for you. Um, but yeah, and so when I finally sort of started coming out of the real miserable part of that experience, I was like, okay, the problem was I was almost 40. I had
How old were you exactly? Like, so you said almost 40, but were you 38, 39?
I must have been 38 because I fought when I was 40. So
Okay.
I must have been 38. Yeah, I was
Okay.
38. And I'd had my dream job. Like I'd had like regardless of the circumstances at Vice, like that's the job I wanted. I was writing about MMA. I was running this website. That's my was my dream job. So here I was, 38 years old, and I didn't know what to do next. And it kind of felt like the thing I needed to do next had to be bigger somehow than what I had done before. Like if I had sort of gone back to just writing about MMA, which I'm doing now and happily doing now, I think after that experience, like if I had gone from running Fightland to freelancing for MMA fighting, I think I would have hanged myself. So I had to do something substantial. And there were two things in the world I hadn't done that felt really significant to me. And one was fight a fight, because I've been training forever. But it was like, as you know, like it's all well and good to fight in a gym. It's all well and good to spar. It's not the same thing. And I always needed, there was always some part of me that needed to know what I would do. I mean, first and foremost, the first time I went to a Krav Maga class, it was simply because I'd been watching guys fight MMA, and I just asking myself, what would I do in that situation? And I had no idea the answer to that question. So I had to know. And then I was like, okay, well, I want to write a book, and I want to fight a fight, and I've got the resume. So if anyone's going to be able to get the opportunity to do this, it's probably going to be me, if provided someone wants a book about cage fighting. So I was like, this is what has to happen. So I don't know if it was a chicken, or I don't know the chicken or egg thing. They were just both things that I really, really wanted to do.
Okay. And then, so when you took the fight, all right. Well, first of all, so you decided you were gonna do this. You got a book deal. What did your gym say? What did the people you trained with say? Were they like, all right, yeah, that's great? Because I mean, it seems like so if you decided you were going to do this at 38 and then you fought at 40, I mean, depending on the time frame, that could have been a year, just over a year to close to 2 years to put into this fight. That's a long time. Most fight camps are 4 to 8 weeks. I mean, you had a year to 2 years. How did you decide you were doing this? Who did you talk to in terms of like your coaches, and how did you actually go about setting it up?
Well, the first person I called was Rafael Sapo Natal, who was
Okay.
a coach, because I was doing Muay Thai at Renzo Gracie's, and I had done I think some MMA classes with him. Yeah, he was running an MMA class, and I had done some classes with him. And I was like, I really like this guy. I've watched him in the UFC. Like I've written about him, and I was like, I think it'd be really cool if he was my coach. So as soon as the book deal came through, I gave him a call and I went and met him, and he couldn't have been cooler about it. I said, I want to fight a fight. He said, okay, we'll fight you. We'll find you a fight. And he put me in touch with other coaches, and he put me in the I got to be in the MMA sort of select MMA class. And he didn't do a lot. He wasn't like on top of me all the time. I felt like it's something I needed to do on my own, but he was just he was there when I needed questions answered, and he kept me sane. And then what I did from there is I really sort of focused on the jujitsu thing, because I hadn't done nearly as much of the grappling thing as I had striking. So I sort of focused on that. And I started going to Gleason's boxing gym because
it's the most iconic boxing gym in the world. I mean, like ever.
One of those places, yeah. Like walk up the long stair.
Now, when you went, all right, so you got to explain to people because they don't understand. Because you're a middle-aged white man walking into Gleason's, and what people don't understand is like boxing gyms. Like MMA gyms, jiu-jitsu gyms, they're for the rich. They're white, middle class gyms that Muay Thai even, you go in and jiu-jitsu is $100-$200 a month. These are expensive, affluent or middle class, at least, training facilities. Boxing gyms are not. And if to get into a boxing gym, usually you start young. Usually it's your dad or, somebody's training you from a young age. You go into a gym, you start really young. They groom you. You don't start as an adult, and you certainly not as here, I live in Phoenix, Arizona. If I were to go into any gym right now and people didn't know who I was through MMA or something, they'd be like, who's this freaking white guy coming in here? Like they'd pretty much run me out. They would laugh me out of there. Right. Did you get that going into Gleason's? Were they looking at you like an alien, or were you welcomed, or how was that?
I found it very welcoming. Yeah, I mean, it is it's definitely not like MMA gyms. You're absolutely right. The sort of the racial dynamics and the cultural dynamics are different in a boxing gym, especially an old time boxing gym, old time Brooklyn boxing gym like that. But I think there's been enough people like me going into those gyms for a long enough time that I didn't feel anything at all. I felt very comfortable in a boxing gym. In fact, more so than I do in MMA gyms. And I like MMA gyms, but there's something a little bit I don't know. There's something going to a boxing gym, an old boxing gym like that. It just feels like everyone has stories. It just feels like there's like a life behind everything there. MMA gyms, you feel like this one opened up 2 weeks ago, and I love MMA and I love doing MMA, but I've never felt the desire in an MMA gym to sort of sit around after class and chat.
Yeah.
Boxing gyms are sort of made for that. Like my coach at the boxing gym, like, I don't think he ever went home. Like he just lived at the gym, and the guys would play gin, and they would just, that was their world. And there was something about that place that you wanted to sort of stick around and be a part of that community. Whereas in MMA, it always kind of, for me anyway, it always felt like, and I know that's not the case for a lot of people, but MMA kind of, they just feel like I go there and I do my work and I go home. There's very nice people there and the whole thing, but they don't, and this is partly because they just haven't been around for very long, but they don't feel like cultural institutions yet. Yeah. They feel like you said, they're like, you put your $200 down and you get to go.
Well, they're also, the whole dynamic is different. You go in, you take classes. A boxing gym, you go in and you hit a bag. Like, it's not, like boxing gyms, you need to be self-motivated. You show up. There's usually, most places, there's a workout on the board somewhere, a chalkboard, 3 rounds of rope, 3 rounds shadow boxing, 3 rounds, of a couple of different combos, and then you do this and that, and then maybe you spar. But you need to be self-motivated to go to a boxing gym. Whereas, it's almost a little, MMA gyms are more commercial. MMA gyms are there to make money and to produce, some of them, MMA fighters. Boxing gyms are there for people to go. It's a barbershop. It's, to go and hang out. You might not even need a haircut, but you're sitting at the barbershop, you know what I mean? Versus, showing up and really getting your work in and just being involved, like you said, in a community, in something cultural.
Yeah, they seem to exist as like their own thing. Like you said, you just sort of, the boxing gym is just sort of there. And I would go to the gym all the time, and there would just be people I knew who I'd sometimes spar with, but sometimes they would just be there in their work clothes, and they would just be hanging out at the boxing gym. It's just not the case in MMA gyms. And they perform different functions, but that I feel like is the big thing. But in terms of, I mean, I felt comfortable in both, but yeah, there's definitely a different thing there. There's a different vibe. I mean, also like, um, there are those boxing gyms. MMA gyms could sort of, because MMA has become so popular, that MMA gyms sort of walk that line a lot of times between, you're building, in some ways you're building fighters, another you're a fitness opportunity for people who want a sort of unconventional way to get in shape.
Yeah.
And there are lots of boxing gyms like that, but they tend to be the sort of newer, slicker, cleaner boxing gyms. A place like Leeson's, it's like you said, it's like you spend your, like you like spend your money on a locker, and there's not any music playing, and it's not about getting in shape in this new way.
It's not about being seen. It's not about, Instagram clicks. It's about, you're going to go in there and get some work in and do some stuff.
Exactly. And I think I just feel more comfortable in that kind of environment.
I'm with you. I appreciate that a little bit. So you've taken a fight, and first, what's wrong with you? Where's your defect? Because I feel like anyone that fights, and I always say this, like, something went wrong somewhere. And you said a little bit, like, did you always wanted to fight? Did you feel like you had something to prove? Like, there was a reason why you fought. I mean, of course it was to write a book, but you could have written a book. You could have chosen motorsports. You could have chosen climbing. You could have chosen any other hobby sport there is on the planet, but you chose fighting. Yeah. And what I find with people that choose fighting is that they've got something to prove to themselves or to someone else. And like, I've got a guy right now who's phenomenal. He's one of the best guys I train. Not Henry Cejudo. He's just a freak beyond freaks when it comes to competition. But somebody else fought in the UFC. He is one of the best guys I've ever trained. And I swear, at some point, somebody called him a pussy or something, or his dad did, or he lost a wrestling match, something. Because, he is so good. And every time we're training, we tell, in between rounds, I'm like, hey, do X, Y, Z, blah, blah, blah. And he starts hitting himself. He's like, yeah, come on. Like, fucking come on. And I'm like, dude, like, you are hard on yourself. Like, he's hearing somebody call him something, or somebody take his lunch money. Something is happening every single time. Right. What did you have to prove? Like, why fight?
That's really interesting. That sounds like a fascinating guy. I don't think about it being, there wasn't like a particular traumatic moment. I feel like maybe the best way to put it is, it feels like there was some part of human experience that I just did not indulge in growing up, that for whatever reason was always in the back of my mind and nagging at me, that I had never been part of this experience. I grew up in a very pacifist family, to their credit. Like, I had a pacifist father. He didn't fight, and a decent pacifist mother. These are all like sweet, caring people who think that you work your problems out verbally and you avoid confrontation, why waste your brain getting it punched out when you could do other things with it, all of which is totally true and totally smart and totally probably the way you should be going through life. But I avoided fights my entire life, and to be totally honest with you, at many times during the course of my life, I felt like a coward as a consequence. Most of the time I didn't think about it. Most of the time it wasn't a concern, but there were enough moments that I had sort of accumulated over the course of my life that I felt like I had been cowardly, that it was never entirely out of my mind. So when I think about fighting now, or especially when I thought about fighting then, it was just, there was something, when you talk about proving something to yourself, I needed to know that I was not a coward. That's really what it came down to. I needed to know that this was not a defining part of my personality. I don't seek out fights. I don't want to be in fights. I don't want to harm anybody. But it killed me, the thought that if push were to ever come to shove, that there might be something inside me that would eat away at me that would not allow me to fight back. And I think that's always been the governing principle, which is why, like, you're talking about this guy, which again is like totally fascinating, but it's not like I get in the gym when I'm sparring, when I was sparring today. It doesn't bother me if someone's better than I am. It bothers me. I mean, it bothers me in that I like to get better, and it bothers me that my footwork isn't working and I'm not getting
On an
I'm not,
analytical level, it
yeah,
bothers you.
I'm not
You want to beat
improving.
the riddle.
Yeah, I'm not
But
improving enough. That bothers me, but it doesn't bother me when a tough guy comes in and and beats me because he's just better than I. It's not that, and it's not. It's just that there is, once I found fighting and I found that feeling of not being a coward, it's since become, it's like a mainline experience. Like I know every time I spar, I get to mainline directly into a feeling of feeling alive and feeling not like a coward and feeling like kind of a full human being in a way I hadn't felt for most of my life. And I feel like, other people find that in all kinds of different places. For me, it's not simply an adrenaline rush. It really does feel like tapping into something that I didn't allow myself to tap into for the longest time. And as a consequence, felt like I was incapable of. And so to this day, years after I've started sparring, I still get that. This morning, I got it. I still get that feeling when someone punches me in the face and I don't curl up in a ball and beg for mercy. Every time that happens, I feel good. Really? So I'm gonna keep doing it until it stops feeling good.
Now so in your book you write, you go over, you start, and then you kind of merge into some other things, but you start with your history, Jewish history, because you're Jewish growing up. Now, and that I thought was interesting because you just touched on a lot of that right there, is that originally, in the early 1900s when Jews first started coming to America, the Jews were not, as well off, as wealthy as a whole. Of course, I'm generalizing right now. I mean, there were poor Jews, there were rich Jews, there were poor and rich Jews back then, but as a whole, this was not a class of, your affluent people. They lived in the ghettos and they were fighters. And then eventually something happened, and most Jews now you kind of assimilate, or kind of associate with lawyers, doctors, white collar, accountant type of jobs. You don't see a lot of Jewish fighters, a lot of Jewish kids doing poor things, which is what you talked about growing up. Was that your family? Was your family just, very pacifist because of the religious side of it, or was it separate from that?
Well, I mean, this is it's a great question, and it's a rich question, because you're absolutely right. I mean, the Jews when the Jews started coming over here from Eastern Europe, and we came over like any other immigrant group. I mean, it was just like, you're coming up hard and you're living in the worst places and you're forced to live in the worst places. And if there's one thing we sort of seen from American history, is that, with each sort of generation, with each new group that comes into the country, they sort of have to go through that initiation. They sort of have to go through that hellfire. And one of the things that they have to do is, when there aren't that many economic opportunities, that's when you get boxers. I mean, fighters come out of, because smart, rich people,
don't fight.
Why risk your brain, in a professional fighting situation? I mean, you have to need to do it. And the only thing that binds together really great boxers throughout history is that they were the poorest people around. I mean, it was the Irish, and it was the Italians, and it was the Jews, and it was the African Americans, and now then you have the Asians, and now you're whatever the sort of lowest on the totem pole is in the American experience, and they're getting kicked the most. You kick something enough times, that's going to be the thing that becomes.
Chris Rock, have you ever seen the Chris Rock skit where he's like talking about the Rocky? He's like, two white men fighting for the heavyweight championship. He's like, now that is a joke. He's like, the black guy's going to fight you better. He's like, Mexican guy's going to fight him even better. He's like, so pretty much the lower on the social ladder you go, the better fighter you are. And, but it's true.
It's totally true. And for a long time there, Jews were at that social strata. They were, they were Jewish fighters and they were Jewish gangsters. I mean, I remember the first time I heard that there were Jewish mobsters when I was like 13 years old. I read about the Jewish mobsters. I had no idea. Then you come to realize like some of the worst mobsters were Jewish. But
What did your parents, are both your parents Jewish or just one or what?
Yes. Yes.
So, and did you grow up in a Jewish household?
I did.
So you guys like went to temple, you guys were practicing Jews and that was a thing.
Not like super religious, but sort of like like the way Christians they'll go on Easter and Christmas.
Okay.
We do the high holidays.
Now, what did your parents think of you when you decided? What did they say when you said, "Hey, I'm gonna fight, and this is what I'm gonna do"? Were they you're nuts or you're? What was their response?
Well, my father had already died by that point. I think my dad would have loved it because my dad was me amplified 1,000 times. Like he was
Okay.
academic and he was just so smart, but he was lived entirely in books and lived entirely in his head. But I think he would have been fascinated at the idea that his son was learning how to box because he probably had read 100 books about boxers. Like he never would think of putting on gloves, but he probably had read every book about it. So I think he would have been really fascinated by it. He would have been confused, but he would have been fascinated. Um, my mother, yeah, I think it's never been. She's never talked me out of it. She's never been negative about it. I think, but I think I established early enough in my life that I was going to be doing things that were probably a little unconventional by family standards. So my mom was used to it by that point. I think that everyone in my family and every one of my friends, and rightfully so, was simply surprised that I was suddenly gave a damn about fighting and was going to try fighting. I think that was the main thing. I think no one ever tried to talk me out of it or said I shouldn't be doing it. It was more just, because of the cultural thing, there was no sort of frame of reference for it. There weren't fighters in my family. It's not like not the world I came up in. But the interesting thing, what you were talking about with the sort of a couple of elements of the Jewish fighter thing, in addition to the America making its poor men fight in rings for a living. But the other issue is, sort of being Jewish, like there was, in addition to my sort of personal concerns about cowardice and coming up and avoiding fights and the whole thing, it's hard not to come up as an American Jew or a Jew born and raised in the second half of the 20th century. It's not hard. It's kind of impossible to not sort of associate your experience and your inheritance with the Holocaust, which is essentially the near destruction of everyone that you're related to.
Yeah.
I, like most of the people I know, most Jews I know, came up with that was just your understanding of the world was at one point not long ago when in fact, your mother was alive when it happened. Your grandmother was, people were alive when it happened. You were this close to being completely wiped off the face of the planet. And that there's that much malice and hatred towards your people that they were willing to go that far. And it's never really, and if you sort of look at history, it's never really that far away. You look at right now, it's never really that far away. So there was that addition to it too, is that part of my fear about both my fear of physical confrontation and my fear of physical confrontation was tied up in that how much of this is me being Jewish? How much of this is sort of an inherited trauma that gets sort of passed down through the blood? How much of it is
feeling like you're broken or not whole based on your past? But it has nothing to do about you. It's just who you are as a people. It's you'd kind of assume that some African Americans growing up kind of in that post segregation era where you're supposed to be equal, but your parents, everyone still looks at you a little weird, even though everything's fine on paper, everything's fine. There's still that tension that is this normal? Am I good or not? And so that's going to, develop throughout your lifetime and affect how you choose.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's sort of two things. I think it's one, like a sort of an inherited fear or an inherited sense of I guess sort of insecurity in the world, and then an inherited sense of just you got to be on your guard. You never know where that malice is going to come from because it always seems to poke its head out again.
Yeah.
And then there's the other issue, which is and this is my personal thing. I don't know if it's other people's personal things, but and this is, I think, probably common among people who are part of traumatic situations, whether it's their own traumatic situation or what I'm talking about, this sort of collective cultural trauma, is it's not uncommon, I think, for the people who are the victims to feel shame. And I think there was a certain amount of shame. I came up learning all about the Holocaust and learning all about World War II and the pogroms in Eastern Europe, because my great grandparents they were already in America by the time the Holocaust happened, but they had been chased out of Russia and Ukraine because there were like mini Holocausts all over the place. And the concern is there's this fear that, or the shame that we didn't fight back, which is a complete bullshit. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, it's not true. But I think that when you have that sort of collective inherited feeling like that, there's going to be some shame involved, that your people didn't fight for themselves, didn't stand up for themselves. And again, I always knew intellectually that was ridiculous, but there was a feeling I had.
Well, intelligence and emotion are like oil and water. Like, you know certain things. Again, you probably felt it getting in, going into the cage, getting ready to fight. You know that you've done everything that you can do. You know that you're better than these people. You're intelligent. You understand on an analytical basis what is happening. And then there's emotion over here. And it's the girl, you're dating the girl who's cheating on you all the time. And you know she's cheating on you. You know she's banging every guy out there, but you just can't get rid of her. You know she's bad, but you just won't break up with her.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, even getting in the cage or the ring at all is so counter. It's so counterintuitive in terms of our brains. Like our no brain would choose to do it. Like everything in your brain, as I was walking to the cage, every part of my intellect is screaming. Every reasonable part of my brain is screaming, "What are you doing?" But when you're in there, as you know, every part of your body and your heart and your emotions is saying, "This is something."
What was the scariest part for you going? Leading into camp. So before you started, you just said, all right, I'm going to go do this. Was the fight itself the scariest part, or was it, were you afraid of the weight cut coming up? Were you afraid of not making the fight, an injury, looking foolish? Like when you decided you were taking this fight, what were you nervous about, kind of at the start of camp, leading into camp, and as that progressed going into the fight, what were your fears?
Well, it's interesting because I was both fighting the fight and writing about the fight. I had plenty of fears in terms of the actual fighting of the fight. Like, for example, I think I was afraid of the weight cut. I've never really denied myself anything that I wanted. So I was a little worried about how I would handle that, and cutting out the drinking and cutting out the sugar and cutting out and putting my body through that. But really, to be honest with you, because I was a writer who had to write this book, I was concerned that after everything I went through, that the experience wouldn't amount to anything.
That it wouldn't be book worthy.
Yeah, that it would not be. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I that it would be something, that it would be a dull, bland, meaningless experience. That once the fight started, and that's kind of how it started. Like it was a 2-minute wrestling match before it really got going and got good. And I actually thought to myself, as I was being held against the cage, how in the world am I going to write about this? Like, this is completely meaningless. Like, I'm just being held against a cage by a guy who just happens to be stronger than I am and a better wrestler. And how do you translate that into something after people have been reading your book for 175 pages? How do you say, oh, by the way, sorry, the fight could not have been more dull?
Yeah, but I think books are all that way. Like, everything, think about all the meaningless things, a guy on a boat, a whole book about a guy on a boat afraid of, trying to catch a fish. I mean, that's a meaningless thing. That's not a story. It's making it a story. There are, transformations. That's what books are. We've all, outside of your superhero, murder mystery type of things, but anything introspective is how you handle it. It could be, somebody pruning a gardener, yes. But that's not the book. It's the transformation in the book. And that's with you. This book isn't about a cage fight. This book is about how a normal human being who is not a fighter decided to take a cage fight and test himself, and that account of it, regardless of what had happened at the end. The book, what they say, it's not the end, it's the journey. And that's what it was with your book. I mean, not to discount it, it was one fight. it's not like it wasn't a heavyweight championship fight for a world title. It was a fight. And this was the story was your adaptation to fighting into a fight camp, not do you win a fight? Do you lose a fight? Is the fight good? Is the fight boring? You might have slipped on a banana peel and not even had the fight, but based on your emotion and the change, because that's a big thing, too. It's just as a writer, you want to see some sort of a change as a human, and we saw that at the end. You tell us about that at the end, and I think that's what we were looking for. Me anyway, as a reader, that's what I wanted to see. I don't really care. Did you win the fight? Did you lose the fight? And I cheat. I looked up if you won or lost before I read the book. I went, but I wanted to see like your thought on it. And that's what after you fight, you talk about the depression and what do you do now? And that was actually the interesting part, because that's something that people don't see, is how, you fight, you get these high highs, but then with high highs, with anything, you take drugs, your highs are high and your lows are lows. And I always had depression after fights, especially the bigger the fight, the bigger the win, the more depression and the bigger the funk I was in afterwards. And it was interesting to see you talk about that and talk about what's next. But that's the fight, really. You win or you lose. I think you had a book there either way. But I could definitely see as a writer going, what the hell do I do now?
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I didn't care if I won or lost. Like I just needed it to be an experience, both for me personally and for being able to write the book. I needed it to be, like you said, transformative. It needed to be something substantial. And I felt like if I had gotten knocked out, that would be a substantial experience. Like I've never been knocked out before. That would be a very new experience.
Right. Don't go plan on getting knocked out for the experience. That's a poor decision. I've been knocked out, and it's not as bad as you think, but you don't need to go do that.
I promise. Yeah. The thing about it was, and you're right, it would have been kind of fascinating to write. Could you write well about being held against a cage for 9 minutes? And you're right. Ernest Hemingway did it with the boat, and lots of writers have done it about seemingly small experiences. I guess my fear was, man, that sounds really hard. like, am I as good as Ernest Hemingway? Like, can I write about being held against a cage and turn that into poetry?
But first of all, your prose is phenomenal. Sometimes, like, as a writer myself, I read that and was like, fuck, I want to punch this guy in the face for being able to, like, I didn't know if I wanted to, like, drink some whiskey with you or punch you for some of your ability to write is phenomenal. And you really do, like, people... And I think this is a great book for people that love good writing to read about fighting. And this is a great book for people who like fighting, who don't read to read. And because you really do merge them well. I've read a lot of MMA books, and the prose is not as good as yours. It's, you're reading Cat in the Hat type books about MMA, and this is not. And so I think, I'm not trying to blow smoke up your ass, but I think if your fight was fucking horrible, I think you would have found a way to write it well.
It would have been an interesting challenge. I think that'd be a very interesting challenge to write about something really boring. I mean, I think to do that well, then you got something.
Then you're good. What did you find, like, looking back, what was the hardest part of the camp for you?
You know what it was? It wasn't sort of one specific thing. It was just midway through the camp, I don't know, whenever that was, when the repetition, when it just became, when it had ceased to be a bunch of new knowledge coming in, and you weren't at the point yet where the adrenaline from the fight was coming up, and there was sort of that middle section where it was just like, every day you're taking the same train to the same gym and wrestling the same people, and it just felt like a slog, and that's what nearly did me in, because
it's the grind. That's what it is.
You pro MMA guys with your embrace the grind shirts and your celebration of the grind, that's so hard for me. And especially, and I talk about this in the book, is that to do that without I had taken away my release. I had taken away drinking, which for me has always been about dealing with the grind of the world, dealing with the everyday of the world, the everydayness of the world. That's why I drink. And I had taken that away from myself. So suddenly it kind of felt like every part of the experience was a grind. And I totally it's so valuable in terms of creating a sort of monastic, angry version of yourself, which is a great way to walk into a cage. But man, actually going through that experience, because I'd spent my entire life being anti-monastic and anti, angry at myself, that it felt like a totally new vocabulary. And it feels like, guys who came up and did wrestling in high school, when they're 35 years old, going through a training camp is probably, that's just par for the course for them. But when you're the kind of guy who spent his entire life indulging every whim he ever had, and then suddenly he's doing the same thing over and over and over again, oh man, I didn't know if I was going to make it. By comparison, the fight was easy.
Yeah, that's I always tell people, a couple things. One, I always tell people the tortoise won the race, not the hare. And everybody wants to go in there sprinting and going, and then they fizzle out because they don't realize, like, hey, look, you can't just do this for a couple months as hard as you want. It's like, nope, you've got 5 years of this before you're going to be any good, and of doing every single day, day in, day out. And that's the thing. It's the middle. I had a fighter, before he was and I remember he was a track runner in high school, and he said he ran the mile, and his coach told him, it's not the first or the last lap that matter. It's the middle ones. Those are the hard ones. Anybody can start off great. You can always push through the end. The end is coming. You can push through it. It's keeping the pace at that middle ground in those middle laps and not like giving away time. And that's it. You see a marathon runner, you can start the first couple miles, you can finish the miles well. It's those middle ones where you just got to keep going and going. There's no light, you're tired, and you just got to keep pushing on. And that's interesting that you say that, because but that's not just MMA, that is life. And as a coach to these guys, I tell them that all the time, is like, stop trying to find the finish line. Like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, any writer, Hemingway, any of these guys anybody that is good at anything in life, they just have done it again and again and again and again and again. And there is no end. It's just grind. And that's what makes you good.
It's true. It's totally true. So I was actually curious, like, as a coach, you must deal with that every single camp, right? I mean,
yes.
So you just have, this fighter needs this to get through week 4, and this fighter needs that to get through week 4. You know their psychology at that point.
Man,
that's a huge part of your.
As a coach, it's always hard balancing too hard, too light, and you got to make sure that you've got two types of fighters in the gym. The ones that you have to pull to the gym every day and get on their ass and be on them and push them. And then you have the people that you have to pull the reins back, that they'll just keep going and going and going. They'll overtrain, overwork, over everything. And you got to find the balance in there. And so you got to know the ones who you've got to get on and push them. And then you've got to know the ones who you've got to pull them back. And you've got to understand when the people that you have to pull back actually have to push, and then you have to understand the people that you have to push when we actually have to pull them back. And that's the hard part. It's just grinding through, finding that balance between push, pull, relax, rest, go hard, day in, day out for weeks on end.
What I was thinking about when I've listened to you talk about coaching, and when I've thought about MMA coaching, especially when you got these 8-week fight camps. By the way, congratulations on John Anik saying you were one of the best coaches.
I appreciate that.
And that was pretty cool. But it makes me think of I was, for a while there, I loved Marlon Brando, and I loved reading about like the method actors and the early method actors, and his main director was Elia Kazan, who did like On the Waterfront and Streetcar Named Desire. And he was sort of the first director who worked with method actors. And he would always, when he was working with actors, he was the first director. It was like this was long before other directors were doing this, where he would really get to know them and take them out for drinks and learn about their families and their past and the whole thing, so that when it came time for a scene where such and such a character had to cry or get really angry, he could take him aside and be like, you remember how you felt when you were 8 years old and this happened? I want you to summon, like, that sort of thing. And I was kind of wondering if you as a coach have to sort of, if it's as much is psychologist like a huge part of your job? Like, is that sitting down and knowing these guys and what they need and what they don't need and when to give them the thing they don't need? I mean, it's got to be more art than science, I would.
I think you're 100% right. And again, it's a balance. In between rounds, I need to give people direct, I would say, like, logical, advice. Like, hey, you've got to do, you've got to shoot, you've got to wrestle, you got to close distance, you got to create distance. There's kind of macro type of instructions. But as a coach, I know there's certain people that do not respond to negative criticism. That if I yell, hey, you fucking pussy, go push it, they will shut down. And so you have to only give them positive reinforcement. And then there's other people that they will only respond to negative criticism. And then there's other people that respond emotionally. Your family, do it for your family, do it for yourself. And then others that just want logic, like that just, you don't need to, like Henry Cejudo. Cejudo, I've been with him a few times now, and we've had some prickly situations. I mean, and I just tell him, like, hey, you have to do this, this, and that, and he will do it. Yeah. The same, and that could be a hard task. It's not like, basically I'm telling him, hey, go punch for punch, sacrifice everything. Like, you're either going to get knocked out or you're going to knock him out. Whereas somebody else, I would have to say that in very emotional terms, yelling and screaming and evoking emotion. With him, I'm like, go throw your body at him as hard as you can. And he's like, okay, done. Like, you don't need...
Well, you did that in the Moraes fight, right? Like in between at round 1 and 2.
He just responds. Like,
matter of fact, and he just came alive.
Yeah, and it's funny because, like, you also have a relationship. Henry and I aren't super close outside of fighting, outside of training and stuff. And we don't need to be. Our relationship is... and we actually fight a lot too. Like, we'll fight on different stuff and get at it and this and that. But when it comes time to coaching, he trusts me to a T, and I don't have to yell at him. I don't have to be emotional. I'm just like, hey, this is what you need to do. And he does it. And then there's other people who don't respond that way at all. And you've got to find a balance as a coach. What makes that person tick? How does that person respond? And once you find out how they can respond, then you can figure out anything. Then it's easy. It's relaying information to people. We're all saying the same thing, but we hear it differently. And, when I used to teach at the college, that was the thing, is we get people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and then people that are all honor high school, grew up rich, everything's perfect. And I've got to explain freaking comma splices to them both. And, how do you explain the same thing to 14 different types of people? That's fighting. I mean, it's just figuring out how you explain stuff to people differently and how they respond.
That's really fascinating. Yeah. Because how many fighters do you have that you like corner?
Too many. Man, I don't even know. There's probably 25 or 30, close to that amount. And so it's crazy. It's different. But one thing I liked that you said in the book is, again, after the fact, we're talking about just emotions and stuff, and you tell people, how did you respond emotionally leading into walking into the cage? Would you walk people through that for your first time, and then walking out of the cage afterwards? Like, those are emotional. Or actually, were you emotional? Were you emotional, or were you emotionless and analytical?
I was surprisingly emotionless walking out to the cage. I actually took myself by surprise. I thought I would be terrified. I thought I would just be like overwhelmed with fear. It was very surprising to me how calm I was when I was walking out to the cage. I don't know if it was just resignation. I think you felt like, there's been so much building up to this that at least I'm here now. At least I get to go. I finally get to go through it and actually have the experience. I don't know what it was, except I remember standing there in the cage when they were announcing me and announcing my opponent, and just feeling like, okay, whatever happens, happens. It was a real sense of resignation.
Did you see a sports psychologist beforehand?
I did not, no.
Okay, and the reason I ask that is, as a coach, and I'm a sports psychologist nut at this point, because that is everything. It's just the way that you approach stuff. You said all of the right things that I want to hear as a coach. And I actually said it recently on one of my podcasts. I said, if you look at a fighter and you know interviews and stuff, and you see somebody that's being interviewed and they're like, oh, I would die, I'm gonna leave it out there, they have to kill me. 9 times out of 10, that's the person that's losing. And then you get somebody else on the other side that's like, hey, I've done everything I can do. I just need to do what I know I can do. The outcomes will take care of themselves. I can't control the outcomes. And that is how you were actually talking and responding. Was you weren't outcome based, you were detail based, only focusing on what you can control. And at the end of the day, that's all we can control. And I wanted to ask you about that because your mindset of what you're explaining leading up to the fight, walking into the cage in there, is what I want to hear as a coach for somebody that I think is going to win a fight. Not to say that you will win a fight, who the hell knows, anything can happen, but you're doing all of the right mental things to win that fight. And that was interesting. Did anybody tell you about that, or is that just the way your brain naturally was, or what?
They didn't tell me anything about that. And the coach who came with me to the ring was a very sweet guy. I didn't really know him too well. He was someone that Sapo had introduced me to. And he was very sweet, and he gave me a little bit of advice before I went out there. But it wasn't, I mean, it was kind of, I felt like I was doing this on my own. But again, like, I think that because the value of the experience wasn't wrapped up in winning or losing, that helped a lot. Because like, if you're coaching a guy who's fighting in the UFC, these guys are competitors. You know, these guys are pro athletes. These guys want to win. Their livelihoods could depend on winning. How much money they make depends on where they rank. I mean, everything depends on that. Their sense of identity, you know, is wrapped up in that. For me, like, again, it was, if when the bell rang and I didn't leap out of the cage and run away or immediately tap out of fear, I had done what I needed to do psychologically. Maybe not literally, but psychologically, I'd done what I needed to do.
What you had said, you didn't cower and you didn't run away. You fought. You stood. You know, you have fight or flight. Are you going to stand up to your aggressor, or are you going to run away and cower out? And you didn't do that. And that was really, it sounds like you already won just by doing that. The outcome is secondary. You stood up to your aggressor. You know, for all of your Jewish past transgressions and all of the, you know, through the Holocaust in your family and everything that you expected yourself to do, you didn't, and you won right there.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, the experience was going to be the thing, and I don't know why. I mean, I don't know if that's why I felt so calm walking to the cage, but I shocked myself with that because I don't know. I was probably scared, but just not in that way. You know, I think I was more scared because I'm not really a performer by nature. I think I was more scared of being in front of 800 people and being the center of attention than I was, you know, if this guy punched, I had been punched a whole lot by that point. This guy probably wasn't, you know, I'd seen footage of him. He wasn't like a murderer. Like, he wasn't like one of these guys who's just going to, and I've trained with some of those guys who are just like, they're going to cream me. I knew it wasn't going to be that. I knew it was relatively even. Whoever won or lost, it was a relatively even thing. So I didn't worry about like getting really damaged. But just the idea of being like standing there, I'm just essentially naked in front of 800 people that I don't know and 40 people that I do know really well. That was more sort of the unnerving experience for me. But the great thing about fighting, as you know, and competing at that level is that, I mean, that stuff sort of vanishes as soon as the fight starts. I mean, no, yeah. I didn't hear a thing once the fight started.
Yeah, nobody's ever afraid of getting hurt in the fight or even so much losing in the fight. What it seems like is everyone's afraid of letting themselves down, letting their family down, and not doing what they know that they're capable of. Right. You know, and which is funny, and that's why sports psychology comes into play, because you can't think about those things because you cannot control those things. But yeah, it was interesting. Where do you go from here? What do you do now? I mean, you know, so you fought. What'd you learn? You learned that you weren't going to cower, and you know, you wrote a book on it, and now again, where do you go? What do you do now?
I mean, this has been the issue. This has been the issue since the fight ended, because I sort of had that high of having fought the fight and the month afterwards where it was just like everything was flying, and then the sort of depression comes in. I got lucky in that the depression was sort of mitigated by the fact that I then had to write the book. So it's sort of like I couldn't really like just wallow too much in the fact that I had come down after being so high. I had work to do. But I'm not going to lie, like it's been a little bit difficult since this whole experience has been over, especially since I finished writing the book and there was like all turned in and there was nothing more I was going to be involved in. It's a little difficult for me to figure out what to do next because it's sort of like, a lot of people, or you get to write a book and it's important to you and it's a great thing and maybe but this was like everything I ever wanted and everything that was meaningful to me was sort of wrapped up in this experience. It wasn't just writing the book, which was super meaningful. It was doing this fight was super meaningful for me. So I've talked myself out of what are probably plenty of good book ideas because they don't in my head match up to that thing. Like I'm thinking that I get caught up in this idea that the next thing has to be as substantial as the thing before it. Whereas I know that that's again, it's the intellect says, no, that's not true. But the heart is saying, why do something if it's not the thing you absolutely have to do?
Yeah.
The most important, like the most significant gun to your head. This is to feel alive. This is what you have to do. You can't go through life like that. But I would be lying to say if I haven't been going through life like that, because I don't really know. I still don't really know what's next after you've had far and away the highest, when you've had the most significant, most alive moment of your life. What do you do with the rest of your life?
Yeah.
That's a question I haven't been able to answer really.
Man, well, you've got some searching to do.
I know. I know.
Uh,
I was hoping you'd have the answer.
yeah, I actually think I might have the answer. I think I have another book idea for you. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, finishing up, what's your favorite part about the book? If you had to show somebody one, and it doesn't just have to be the writing, but something you learned, an experience during the time, maybe a random piece of information that you learned or saw or something in that book, Why We Fight. What's your favorite part?
I think if there's one thing that I really liked, because like as you say, it was because there was a lot of sort of revelatory stuff for me. I'm not a science guy. Like all of the scientific and anatomical knowledge came from me interviewing professors. Like this was me like admitting on my knees, if I tried to read this in a book, I wouldn't understand it. So I'm coming to you to talk at me slowly. So all that knowledge I loved acquiring all that knowledge. But there's one thing in particular. I stumbled upon an article about a guy doing some research on like slate.com or something. It was a throwaway article. And I'm reading this thing and I was like, oh my God. So I called this guy and it comes at the end of the book. And it's this psychologist, like an academic psychologist who's had an experience through meditation at some point in his life where he had that transcendent experience where he felt like he was at one with the world and he felt like he had left his body and had a transcendent experience. And instead of just enjoying the experience, being a doctor or being a scientist, he started to research it. And I called him on the phone and I talked to him because I'd had the experience when the fight was over that was the first time in my life, 40 years old, that I felt like I had what could be considered a religious experience or a transcendent experience where I felt like really like all of the voices in my head went quiet and I felt completely connected to everyone around me and to the whole world. It really felt like something that you read about. Something happens to a poet or a religious person. It really was a remarkable thing. And this guy had done a bunch of research where he had done brain scans of people who were going through what he considered to be what he called self-transcendent experiences. Like you're in war, like you're bonding with your fellow soldiers, or astronauts looking at the Earth from the moon, and other things like that. People in deep meditative states who are trained in meditative states. People who had done something like what I had done in terms of that experience. And they actually figured out that the part of your brain that distinguishes your ego from other egos, that actually identifies yourself to yourself, that part of the brain shuts down in those self-transcendent experiences. So all those cliches we have, all that poetic language you have where you say, I felt connected to the world, it's scientifically true. And it's a one paragraph section of the book, and it kind of summed up everything that I got to. It was both poetic and metaphorical and literary, and allowed me to indulge all my worst romantic tendencies as a writer, but it was so grounded in an actual thing that science had actually found the reason why we speak poetically about those moments.
Yeah.
That for me kind of summed it up.
That's funny that you say that. I actually wrote a novella basically on something similar as topic, psilocybin, magic mushrooms and LSD and all of that stuff. For years, they thought that they activated the brain and made it hyperactive. And it actually turns out the same part of the brain that you're talking about that actually reduces it, slows it down, and shuts it down. Which is why people get a oneness with the things around them, with the universe, because their ability to distinguish between the self and the not self is diminished. So everything is them and us and connectedness, and that's interesting because that's a very very analytical way to express a very emotional feeling. So you have a scientific response to give you the most emotional experience you'll ever have ever. So which is great, just funny in the sense of irony.
Yeah, and I think it's for me it sums up what I was trying to do and hope I did with the book, was that trying to understand what is like a totally bodily human deep down kind of human experience, but is also the most spiritual, transcendent, inexplicable, ineffable thing that people do. And it's both those things at once. And to be totally honest with you, it never crossed my mind when I was preparing to write the book or training for the fight that I would experience that. It never crossed my mind. And then suddenly I found myself in that moment, and it kind of felt like, oh, this is why I did it. This is why I just went through everything. This was the reason, and I didn't know it.
You did a really good job using. We touched on this earlier. Using logic and analysis and information to explain an emotion, and that's what I think readers are going to appreciate with this, especially people who haven't fought, people that don't know, people that don't understand it. You do a good job of explaining that. And then for all of us calloused barnacles over here who have done this our whole life, you're like, oh, wow, that is how this is. We just are so callous to it that we just don't necessarily see it that way. And it was a good blend. It was a good marriage of everything.
Right. You guys don't realize how you're living transcendent all the time. You've become numb to the transcendence.
We're just transcending all over the place, all over the universe, everywhere. Well, Josh, it was good to chat with you. Where can people find you? Are you on Twitter? Are you on social media? You're on Instagram?
Twitter, Josh Rosenblatt 1 on Twitter, and I think the same thing on Instagram.
And where can people buy your book, Why We Fight?
Anywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, indie bookstores. You can go to my website, joshrosenblatt.com, for more information. But yeah, it's in all the bookstores.
Awesome. Well, go out, get the book, and it was a pleasure, man. Great chatting with you.
Pleasure. Thank you, Santino.
All right. Thanks, Josh.